Dear friends, yesterday we have discussed about post-structuralism and we tried to discuss the difference or distinctions between structuralism and post-structuralism. And with the four headings, we have started to talk about the distinctions between structuralism and post-structuralism, in which we talked about the first one about its origin, then we talked about tone and style, then we talked about attitude to the language, and then in attitude to language, we have discussed about how the whole idea that post-structuralism carries with itself is insisting upon the consequences of the view that reality itself is textual. And that's why post-structuralism develops certain anxiety, terminal anxieties about the possibility of achieving any knowledge through language. Even yesterday, we discussed about the verbal sign is constantly floating free in concept as it is supposed to be designated. Likewise, the meanings words can have never be guaranteed that the meaning is 100% sure. Thus, we can say that words are actually contaminated by their opposites. And if we want to get the meaning and understanding of it, we always take the support of the opposites. And even yesterday, we discussed the example of night and day, good and evil, or good and bad. And if you see the opposites which they are coming together, these opposites or these types of understandings about the meanings of the words are interfered with by their own history. Some retain the absolute senses, some retain the troublesome and ghostly presence with present day usage. Some words materialize just when we thought that those words and its meanings are safe to use. Thus, seemingly an innocent word like guest is etymologically cognate with host, and host is the word which etymologically appeared in English from Latin, and in Latin it is called as hostis, Hostis. And the meaning of hostis is very interesting. In Latin language, the meaning of hostis is enemy. Now, if you go to the history of the history of the word says some different meaning, but what we apply, what we discuss is some different sort of meaning. And if you try to follow the original meaning of the word host, that is enemy, then you have to unwelcome the guest. So there is always a linguistic anxiety. And this linguistic anxiety is the keynote of the post-structuralist outlook. Now we'll take the fourth heading and we will discuss about the fourth heading of difference or distinction between structuralism and post-structuralism. Now, structuralism questions about our way of structuring and categorizing the reality. And it prompts us to break free of habitual modes of perception. There are typical ways of perception. We perceive something with one particular idea as such. And structuralism is always prompting us to break that habitual modes of perception or habitual mode of categorization, the words, categorization, the whole structure. The post-structuralism is much more fundamental because it distrusts the very notion of reason. It distrusts the idea of human being as an independent entity. Post-structuralism is preferring the notion of dissolved, dissolved into, or it is preferring to a constructed subject. You decide it, you defined, you find out, you planned something. Whereby what we may think of as individual, individual is real. Individual is actually a product of social and linguistic forces. That is not an essence. It is merely the tissues of textuality on which the whole Western civilization is built up, because it always tries to have a torch of skepticism burn away the intellectual grounds. They are not interested in discussing on intellectual grounds. And that's why post-structuralism is trying to find out its own way. Now, if you try to find out the very interesting notion of this post-structuralism, because we have to understand very important fact about post-structuralism. As we have seen that structuralism developed a model of reading texts and cultural artifacts, even structuralist narrative theory, for example, generated certain schemes of reading for novels and poetry. It is unpacking the elements that constituted the text's meaning itself. It was rigorous textual analysis that is paid close attention to language and form. That's why we can say it was rather formalic. If you see, structuralism was to seek an order, particular order, a structure, a structure to novels, a structure to poetry, a structure to music, a structure to visual text, a structure to even menu card. It is having its own pattern. It defines its pattern, schemes. And always structuralism assumes that the text would yield its meaning once you reach to its core element. But in 1960s, literary critics, philosophers, they began to rebel against what they saw as a restrictive and limited critical practice of viewing the world. There is civilian unrest. If you see the French philosophers and thinkers in the latter part of 20th century, those philosophers and thinkers, they were associated with various unrest which were part of the then society. There's a student rebellion in 1968 in Paris. Or there were a lot of geopolitical disasters like Vietnam War. Actually, post-structuralism, as I said yesterday, it was a philosophical movement. It was the expression of a sense of disillusionment, the condition in which we are now facing, we are now living. Lockdown or no lockdown, what to do in this pandemic. We are having such type of sense of disillusionment. That's why post-structuralism seems to be very close to the hearts of most of the scholars today also. A disillusionment with the nation state or with the philosophy of emancipation or ideas of critical thinking. Post-structuralism emerged as a rupture, a shift away from what the prominent thinkers saw as the formulaic or a typical ordered work of structuralism. There were various critiques, thinkers. Roland Barthes, we spoke about Roland Barthes in structuralism. He was one of the major thinker of structuralism. But Roland Barthes' latter work moved away from his structuralist phase. And he was one of the foremost, or you can say the first, to start speaking of openness of texts. the text connections with other texts, or the reader's role in production of meaning. Even the topic which we are going to discuss after this is deconstruction, which is one of the most important part of post-structuralism. The writings of Jacques Derrida, Jacques, Jacques, Jacques Derrida, who in mid 1960 appeared in the form of conference paper. He first of all presented himself in a conferences with lots of research paper. And later on, his very famous book called Of Grammatology, published in 1976, which was actually written in French language, later on translated by Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak into English. And if you see from 70s, from early 70s through the 1980s and even the 1990s, the work of Jacques Derrida, who is the historian of ideas, Michel Foucault, the philosopher Jean-Francois Lyotard. Please remember these names. These are the most important thinkers of 20th century. Jean-Francois Lyotard, Gilles Deleuze, Felix Guattari, or the Marxist critic like Frederick Jameson, the semiotician psychoanalyst Julia Kristeva, or the postmodernist Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, Slavoj Zizek, Jean Baudrillard, and then feminists like Judith Butler. All these thinkers, they created a movement in literary criticism, media studies, and even philosophy. So post-structuralism has close contiguities, both on the level of thematic and contextual level, with the most important movement called postmodernism. It has a close proximity with postmodernism. Even post-structuralism has been one of the most influential movements in philosophy and critical theories in 20th century. And it makes, or it helped the rise of the new forms of thinking in social sciences also. For example, if you take the works of James Clifford or Clifford Geertz or Michael Taussig in the field of anthropology, or James Derrida in the field of political theory, or Bruno Latour in social studies of science and new historicism. So post-structuralism has changed the whole sense of understanding, has changed the whole understanding, the whole meaning of getting the things done. The emergence of Roland Barthes and Jacques Derrida, these two figures in critical thinking, changed the whole perception of structuralism. Now, if you see very carefully, Roland Barthes published the essay named The Structural Analysis of Narrative. And The Pleasure of the Text in 1973. Now, the first essay, The Structural Analysis of Narrative, is actually a study which is detailed, methodological, and forbiddingly, you can say, technical. While the second essay, The Pleasure of the Text, is really a series of random comments on narrative arranged alphabetically and thereby, of course, emphasizing on the randomness of material. If you see very carefully, in between this, the production of these two seminal essays of Roland Barthes is very crucial essay which allowed the text to be free from various clutches. The text written in 1968 and the title is The Death of the Author. Now this death of the author is the hinge around which Roland Barthes turns from structuralism to post-structuralism. In that essay, if you see, Roland Barthes announces the death of the author. Now, please understand, the death of the author is in the rhetorical way of asserting independence of the literary texts and its immunity to the possibility of being unified or limited by certain notion of because whenever a writer writes, the writer used to follow, excuse me, the writer used to carry forward or used to carry certain notion in his mind. When he writes something, he is having his own understanding of giving or presenting something to its reader. And that's why you will find out there is a limited subjectivity that we are trying to find out with the writer's idea that he has crafted into his work. Now, instead to focus upon the writer Roland Barthes in this essay makes a declaration of radical textual independence, you can say, my friends. It is a sort of textual independence which is taken care by the essay. Roland Barthes is trying to mention or is trying to point out that the work is not determined by some intention or context, because what we discussed, what we talked about, the writer's role in our understanding of structuralism. When we are talking about structuralism, we discussed about all this understanding. And if you see very carefully, Roland Barthes is trying to point out that the text is free by its very nature of such all restraints. Text is itself free in itself. You need not to show that the text is having certain ideas, because if you're restricting the whole idea by pointing out that the author has certain intention in writing in all those things, and that's why when you talk about the whole understanding of liberal humanist theories, you will find out that in those liberal humanist theories, what happened, the focus, the attention is with the author's intention and why the author has written all those things, why he's talking of all those things. But looking into the matter that Roland Barthes is trying to point out, that the text itself is free from all these clutches, that you cannot say that there is a particular intention or context that writer is trying to write down. You cannot restrict it with certain particular understanding or idea. It is, text is itself free. That's why in this essay, Roland Barthes says the colliery death of the author. If there is a death of author, there is a birth of reader. So you have to understand this basic, very interesting notion. So the difference between the essays, the first one written in 1966, what Roland Barthes' first essay we talked about, the structural analysis of narrative, and the essay written in 1973, the second essay, The Pleasure of the Text, and in between he wrote this particular essay called The Death of the Author in 1968. You will find out there is, or this death of the author is a shift of attention from text, which is seen as something produced by the author. Because usually what happens when you see the text, you start to point out that it is produced by some author. But this essay, or you can say this book, has shifted the whole attention from the text, seen as something produced by the author, and it has shifted its whole attention towards the reader, stating that something is produced by the reader. As it were, by the form of language, Because when reader reads certain thing, he formulates his own meaning, he formulates his own understanding, not essential to follow what author is trying to say. The reader may have his own way of getting meaning of those texts. So the text is free from the author, what author has produced. It is reproduced, you can say, in one way by the reader himself. So Roland Barthes is saying that in the absence of the author, because author is not present at every reading, the claim to point out, to decipher a text, because if the author is not present, you are not able to find out what intention, what the author is intended to, what this author wants to express. We are not able to find it out in a proper way. So the text becomes futile if the author is absent. And that's why the text becomes futile, absolutely futile. Hence, we can say that the early phase of post-structuralism seems to give a license and enter into the endless free play of meanings. It can vary from reader to reader. Whatever one reader is reading, it is absolutely changing from every reader's reading. It is escaping from all forms of textual authority. Once you allow the reader to find out its own meaning, then the authority is over that text. It is moving away all the authorities of the text. Certain critics, certain scholars, certain readers, they may have their own authority to comment on that particular text. So it is making the text, it is making the whole text absolutely free from all sorts of pressures that a text carries with itself. And that's why you will find out, my friends, there is an inevitable shift from this textual permissiveness, that you are getting someone's permission. It is commonly, if I make it a little bit simple for you to understand, that when you try to read any particular text, you take a support of someone who has given a meaning of that, what the person is want to talk about, and understanding the meaning at first, then you start reading it and you try to follow the path of the person who gives you the meaning. We are under pressure of some. It is commonly, most of the students used to say that we are trying to study the critical critical of that particular original text. We don't read original text because we are not able to get the meaning of it. It happens mostly with poetry. It happens mostly with uh, the dramas written in Elizabethan period. We usually think that we are not able to find out the meanings of all those things. So we are taking support of someone, and with the footsteps of that particular person, we try to find out the meaning of it. So we are binding the text with various things, and Roland Barthes is saying that once you say that the author is dead in this text, now you are free to find out your own meanings. And that's why you will find out, my friends, the idea of deconstruction becomes most important in this case. Jacques Derrida, that's why Jacques Derrida is supposed to be one of the most important key figure of post-structuralism. Now, another important name in this regard Let me again repeat it to my all my friends that because this is not the paper of critical theory, this is not the paper of critical understanding, this is a paper of research methodology. I'm giving you a brief outline that which theory you can take for making up your ground for the research framework. This is an introductory, this is a beginning. If you follow certain theory, if you understand certain theory, if you think that I should follow that, you can later on go deep into reading about that particular theory, reading the essay and trying to find out the meanings and what are the various notions that those essays are talking about. And that's why I'm giving you various names of the critics so that you can able to find out their writings, so that you can able to find out what sort of texts they discussed. And that's why I've given you the idea that in post-structuralism you have this much kind of critics that you need to have, of which I have given you a simple the simple primary outline, preliminary outline of Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author, written in 1968. Now, the second important critique or thinker of post-structuralism is Michel Foucault. Actually, I have to talk about Jacques Derrida, but as we have a special topic of deconstruction, so that I'm not discussing Jacques Derrida right now. I'll discuss Jacques Derrida when we start with deconstruction, and then again we are going to talk about post-structuralism. So please understand, once you start with structuralism, you cannot say that I have lived structuralism and enter into post-structuralism. For understanding post-structuralism, you have to understand structuralism. And for understanding post-structuralism, you need to understand deconstruction also. So all the things are closely connected with each other, like an Olympic ring, that they are incorporated into one into another. So the second, or I can say third most important, I'm not giving the numbers to them, the another important thinker is Michel Foucault. Michel, Michel Foucault, Foucault. Please remember the spellings very correctly. Well, all these are the French names, these are not English names, and that's why the pronunciation is a little bit different than the spellings. Now, Michel Foucault, who is actually the professor of the history of systems of thought, he developed what he called the archaeology of human sciences, in which Michel Foucault studied the rise of the forms of knowledge, the classificatory mechanism of knowledge, and the rules by which the knowledge was collected. The knowledge was archived and later on disseminated. Foucault's interest lay in unpacking the underlying structures of thinking in the various fields of knowledge. Because Foucault argued that these structures of knowledge, they are conditioned and they are constructed, they are not natural. They are conditioned as per the requirement of the system. That's why I said this structure, the process of inquiry, which you say knowledge gathering, or the very nature of the object about which knowledge is being gathered. For what are the reasons that we gathered all the knowledge? That's what we have talked in understanding of the first unit. In the first unit, that you have to gather certain information. And why you are gathering all those information? Because you have certain object for it. So what is the object? That's why you have gathered all the knowledge. And the third one is the possibilities and possibilities of using and distributing this knowledge. What are the possibilities that you are distributing? How you are distributing the knowledge? In other words, you can say, my friends, Michel Foucault, he saw scientific inquiry as an exercise in power, where you will find out the physician or the scientist or the psychiatrist, they constructed a particular condition. And for that condition, they call it as disease. And they have an object that we can call it as disease. And they try to investigate it. And they try to get knowledge about it, so that they can carefully controlled by certain authorities. It is a very proper time to understand how Foucault is talking about all those things. Look out this situation. For the doctors, for the physicians, for the scientists, and even for the psychiatrists, today's pandemic situation is a sort of disease. They're trying to investigate corona. They're trying to gather knowledge, and they're controlling the knowledge. They're giving the knowledge whatever is required, whatever is essential, they are giving that much knowledge to you. Controlling the whole thing. That's why Foucault's remark is very important to understand post-structuralism, because again, as I say you in last lecture, that post-structuralism is a philosophical process. Structuralism is a linguistic process. So according to Michel Foucault, knowledge is constructed, organized, shared, and used through particular forms of speech, writing, and language. I'll repeat it so that you can able to understand it comfortably. What Foucault is saying? Foucault is saying that knowledge is constructed, organized, shared, and used through particular forms of speech, writing, and language. And for this, he used a term called discourse. What is discourse according to Michel Foucault? Discourse is knowledge constructed, organized, shared, and used through particular forms of speech, writing, and language. That's why discourse is the context of speech. Representation, knowledge, and understanding. Discourse is the context of speech, representation, knowledge, and understanding. It defines what can be said, it defines what can be studied, and in the process of doing so, for example, if you take a very common example, it is in the court of law. Emotions and emotional responses to the question cannot be taken as an answer. You have seen that, or else you have seen in most of the movies, not visited to the real court of law, but you have seen in most of the movies that court will not respond, court will not answer to the emotions. If you are crying in front of a judge and saying, I am innocent, I'm innocent, court will say, no, will not think, will not consider your cry because you are emotional, you are crying, will not prove it. The court always insists the defendant or the accused, you can say, to answer the questions, not with the tears, not with your laughter. You have to answer the questions which is asked, you have to answer those questions. Michel Foucault says this is the discourse of law. Discourse of law in the court relies upon what it sees as evidence. The whole process of court is based on evidence, logical and rational argumentation, how you argue. It believes, it thinks on your arguments rather than your angry outburst or your hysteria. It is not taking care of all those things. Similarly, in the case of science, you need to prove the thing, you need to do work in the laboratory and try to prove it and show it to the world. It is not sufficient in science to say that I believe this is to be true. No. Science will say, no, we will not accept it. If you are thinking it is, and I think that it is true. No. There's no chance for think in science. You need to have a logic and argument and try to research it and try to prove it with certain experiments. So the discourse of science asks for empirical demonstrable proof that is true. Foucault's originality lay in discerning the underlying structures of power. Foucault is trying to focus on the underlying structures of power. Those underlying structures of power that informed the neutral scientific inquiries, that there should not be any biased or prejudiced inquiries, neutral inquiries. And those inquiries should be scientific inquiries with logic, with empirical demonstrable proof. He argued that some section of population were classified into various categories, if you see very carefully. And for that, institutions has been developed. There are classification in the society or in the population with sick, SICK, sickness, or criminals, or mad. So this section of the population can be kept under surveillance, placed at one particular institution. It should be observed by particular kind of authorities. You are watching this position right now. If you are sick, you are under observation. Somebody is surveilling you, somebody is looking after you. They are trying to point out, they are trying to focus on you. There are particular kinds of authorities who are looking off. No, everyone is not taken care of. You have been gathered and kept at one particular place. Nowadays, we call it as a COVID care centers. Foucault is saying there are certain institutions built up, and this surveillance was coded as a discourse, a terrain of thought, a system of knowledge, a particular kind of language that allowed something to be said and disallowed some others to understand. There is specific kind of language. See the language of doctors. See the language of lawyers. A specific kind of knowledge that allowed some to understand, some to disallow to understand. And that's why Foucault says that the priest use the discourse of religion, of sin and salvation in order to preach particular norms of behavior in domains like marriage, family, sexuality, charity. There are norms of behavior defined by religion or religious institutions. Or the physician use the discourse of sickness and health in order to prescribe a particular kind of lifestyle. Or the psychiatrist concerned constructed a particular kind of behavior that is deviant through a discourse of rationality. Your behavior is not according to the rational. That is what psychiatrists can able to say directly. So if you see very categorically, my friends, Foucault's major contribution, has been to show how this discourse condition, how the discourses condition the whole people's lives and even inform their thinking. All this discourse control. By focusing on power as central to human condition. Power is the most important thing, and that's why it's very famous as a knowledge and power. Power is the central thing in defining human conditions. Foucault was able to argue that human relations, science, institutions, all various institutions that human being has developed, all these institutions are all caught up in the struggle of power. Who will control whom? Everyone is struggling for gaining power over another. And discourse is a terrain on which the whole struggle is carried out. The person or the institution that controls discourse also controls the subjects in those discourse. And that's why what Foucault is trying to point out, is trying to build up, is very interesting when that Foucault underscore the discursive basis of power, social relations, and institutions. Any institutions you can take from sociology, my friends. He's trying to bring out in front of us that the so-called objective disciplines like science is relied upon underlying assumptions about the object to be investigated. It is having certain assumption, and as we have seen it at the beginning of research methodology, that you have to assume certain things and then you can able to enter into research. So Foucault is saying science is developed on assumptions, and for that it used a particular kind of language. It should have a particular process of thinking and a particular thought in order to talk about this particular object in science. And after constructing all those things, it is developing an institution around that object for its study and control. So Foucault is mentioning that we have to understand this construction of knowledge for using power, developing particular institutions. Again, what Foucault talks about various discourses. We'll talk about all those discourses in tomorrow's lecture, my friend.